The noon sun scorched the wide plains of Arizona Territory, a land so dry that even the wind seemed to scrape like sandpaper. The air shimmered above the cracked ground, and the far-off mesas stood like silent guards of the desert's secrets. Out there, where even the vultures circled lazily, a desperate cry echoed, a sound too human to be ignored. From the saddle of his chestnut horse, Jesse McGraw, a lone cowboy riding the border trail, halted and turned his head. He'd been tracking cattle rustlers all morning, but what he heard wasn't the shout of a man or the cry of a coyote. It was the faint, broken sob of a child. The cowboy shaded his eyes and squinted toward a cluster of red rocks, glimmering like embers against the horizon. There, amid the stone, something moved, a small shape stumbling in the dust. A child, barefoot and wild-eyed, no older than 7, running toward him with tears streaking her sunburned cheeks. She stumbled and fell, and Jesse leapt from his saddle, boots crunching into the dirt as he rushed forward. The girl's lips were cracked, her voice barely a whisper, but she kept repeating the same words, over and over. "My mommy, the Apaches, they tied her to the rock, please, help her." Jess's blood ran cold. He'd seen cruel things out here in the frontier. Bandits, revenge killings, and lawmen who had long since forgotten mercy. But there was something different in the child's terror. He looked past her, to where the mesas rose like the backs of sleeping beasts, and saw a faint shimmer. White cloth, maybe, against the red stone. Without another thought, he lifted the girl into his arms and rode hard toward the rocks. The journey was short, but every second burned like fire. The sun beat down, and the air smelled of dust and death. When Jesse reached the cluster of boulders, he saw her, the woman the child had spoken of. She was tied upright to a sun-baked rock, her wrists raw from rope burns, her skin blistered by the relentless heat. Her long black hair was tangled with dust, and her face, though weary, still held the fierce dignity of the Apache. Her eyes opened weakly as the cowboy approached. Fear flickered there at first. She had no reason to trust a white man, but then her gaze softened when she saw the little girl safe in his arms. Jesse knelt, cutting through the thick ropes with his hunting knife. The cords fell away, and the woman slumped forward into his arms. Her skin was burning hot, her pulse faint. He laid her gently on a blanket from his saddlebag, and poured a trickle of water between her cracked lips. The child knelt beside her mother, whispering words in Apache, a prayer or maybe a lullaby. The woman's chest rose weakly as she breathed, and tears rolled from the corners of her eyes, not from pain, but from the sight of her daughter safe. As the wind picked up, Jesse looked around. The marks in the sand told their story. Horses had been here, at least 5 or 6, the hoofprints still fresh. A gang of bounty hunters, maybe, or settlers looking for revenge. The tension between white ranchers and the Apache was running high, and Jesse knew that this wasn't a random cruelty. It was punishment. Someone wanted to make an example of her. The cowboy's jaw tightened. He wasn't one for politics or tribal feuds, but he knew right from wrong. Whatever this woman had done, or been accused of doing, leaving her to die in the desert was murder. He lifted her carefully and placed her across his horse's saddle, then helped the child climb up behind. The sun was sinking low, bleeding across the sky, when Jesse turned his horse toward the distant line of cottonwoods that marked the river. He'd make camp there for the night and try to bring her back from the edge of death. The journey was slow. Every hoofbeat echoed with a sense of dread. The desert seemed to hold its breath, as if watching this strange procession. Cowboy, child, and dying woman, making their way toward whatever fate awaited them. By the time they reached the riverbank, twilight had painted the land in gold and purple. Jesse built a fire, fetched water, and tended to the woman's wounds as best he could. Her skin was cracked and swollen from the sun, but her breathing had steadied. The girl sat close by, never letting go of her mother's hand. As the stars blinked to life, Jesse leaned back against a rock, staring into the flames. He didn't know her name, or why she'd been left to die. But he could feel it deep in his gut, this wasn't over. Whoever had done this would come looking, and when they did, they wouldn't stop at the woman. The sound of a night bird echoed across the river valley. The wind shifted, carrying a faint scent of smoke, not from his fire, but from somewhere upriver. A campfire, maybe, or the remnants of one. Someone was close. He rested a hand on his revolver. The child was asleep now, curled against her mother's side. The woman stirred faintly, her eyes opening just enough to meet his. In a voice so soft it was almost lost in the wind, she whispered a single word, one he didn't understand, but one that carried both gratitude and warning. Jesse didn't answer. He just nodded, his expression hard beneath the flickering light. The desert night stretched silent around them, but in that stillness, the cowboy could feel the promise of danger. Somewhere out there in the darkness, the men who tied her to that rock were still watching. And they would be coming back. The morning broke slow and silent, its first light spilling across the red cliffs and rippling over the sleeping figures by the riverbank. The desert seemed gentler now, its cruel heat still a few hours away, the air cool enough to breathe without pain. A thin line of smoke rose from the remains of last night's fire, curling lazily into the pale dawn sky. Jesse McGraw woke first. Years on the frontier had taught him to sleep light, to listen to the wind, the horses, and the earth itself. Something in the air told him they weren't alone. The silence felt different, too careful, too expectant. He rose quietly, his hand brushing against the handle of his revolver, and scanned the river's edge. The sand bore faint marks, hoofprints half buried by the night breeze. They were fresh, no more than a few hours old. Someone had been watching their camp. A few feet away, the Apache woman still lay wrapped in his blanket. Her breathing was stronger now, though her face was pale beneath the sun, darkened skin. The child, her daughter, slept curled beside her mother's arm, her hair tangled with dust and river grass. The sight of them stirred something in Jesse that he hadn't felt in years. He had known hardship, loss, betrayal. But the bond between this woman and her child carried a quiet strength. Something sacred even out here in the lawless wasteland. He moved to the horse and checked his rifle, then crouched to study the tracks. 6, maybe 7 horses. The same number he had seen near the rock where he found the woman. Their trail led west, but the way the sand was scuffed told him one rider had broken off, perhaps to circle back, perhaps to spy. It meant trouble was close. As the sun climbed, the woman stirred. She tried to sit, but her arms trembled with weakness. Jesse helped her drink from the canteen, and tore a strip from his shirt to wrap her raw wrists. Though she said nothing, her dark eyes followed every motion with careful attention. There was intelligence there, sharp and silent. A survivor's gaze. By mid-morning, the camp was packed and the trio rode east toward the mountains. Jesse knew the land well enough to avoid the open plains. The canyons would offer shade, maybe even a stream. The woman, though frail, held on with surprising endurance. The little girl rode behind her mother, clutching the blanket tight, her small face hidden from the relentless wind. As they rode, Jesse's thoughts churned like the dust beneath his horse's hooves. Who were the men who had done this? Settlers, angry over some raid. Bounty hunters working for a crooked sheriff, or renegades who simply enjoyed cruelty. He couldn't say, but there was something about the woman's bearing, some quiet nobility, that made him suspect she was not just any Apache. Perhaps a leader's wife, or sister, or daughter, someone whose suffering would send a message. By noon, the canyon walls rose around them like the ribs of a great beast, casting cool shadows that stretched across the sand. Jesse halted by a patch of mesquite trees and let the horses rest. The woman drank and ate a few scraps of dried beef he offered. She didn't touch the gunpowder biscuits. Perhaps from pride, perhaps from suspicion. But she accepted the water, and that was enough for him. For a while, all was still. The wind whistled through the canyon's cracks, and the girl gathered smooth stones from the riverbed. Then, faintly, from far behind them, came a sound, a single echoing crack that rolled through the canyon like thunder. A rifle shot. The horses shayed and stamped. Jesse dropped low, eyes narrowing toward the canyon mouth. Dust was rising in the distance. Riders were coming. He moved quickly, pulling the woman and her child behind a cluster of rocks and motioning for silence. From their hiding place, he could see them now. 5 riders, their shapes shimmering through the heat. Even from afar, he recognized the broad, brimmed hats and the way their rifles gleamed in the sun. Not Apaches. White men. Rough, unshaven, their saddles heavy with rope and guns. Bounty hunters. They were searching. The leader, a big man with a red beard, rode to the riverbank and dismounted. He knelt to the ground, tracing the tracks Jesse had left. The man's voice echoed faintly through the canyon, barking orders. The others spread out, circling like wolves. Jesse's mind raced. The canyon was narrow, they couldn't outrun them. The woman, though stronger, couldn't ride hard enough yet to escape. He had 2 choices: fight or vanish. He chose both. He led the horse deeper into the canyon's maze, following a dry creek that wound through jagged stone. Every few hundred yards he broke a branch, scuffed a track, and doubled back, leaving just enough signs to send the hunters in the wrong direction. Then, he led the woman and child into a narrow hollow beneath an overhang. The shadows swallowed them whole. Hours passed. The shouts of the men grew distant, fading into the hum of the desert. When at last the sound died away, Jesse emerged cautiously, his clothes soaked in sweat, his heart still beating hard. The woman's eyes met his. There was no need for words. She understood what he'd done. As the sun began to fall behind the ridges, painting the world in red and gold, the trio pressed on. They followed the canyon east until the walls opened onto a wide valley of sage and stone. In the distance, the faint shimmer of a settlement marked the edge of white man's territory. A mining camp, or perhaps a trading post. It could mean food, water, safety, or a noose. Jesse knew he couldn't risk it yet. Whoever those men were, they had connections. Someone had paid them to do what they did. And that someone would still want the Apache woman dead. Night came swiftly, the desert sky ablaze with stars. They camped near a dry stream, hidden beneath the shelter of boulders. The woman slept uneasily, her daughter's small hand resting over her heart. Jesse sat awake beside the dying fire, his hat pulled low, listening to the night sounds. The whisper of wind, the cry of a far-off coyote, the steady beat of his own doubts. Somewhere deep inside, he felt the weight of a choice forming. A road that would soon split in 2 directions. He could leave them to find their people, wash his hands of the trouble. Or he could stay, knowing full it would drag him into a war not his own. The fire crackled softly. The stars turned above, and far beyond the valley, under that endless western sky, the red-bearded man and his gang were not yet done searching. Their leader spat into the dust and pointed toward the mountains. He knew the cowboy's kind, solitary, stubborn, and dangerous. But no man could outrun vengeance forever. As the last ember of the campfire faded, the desert fell into silence once more. The next dawn would bring pursuit again. And with it, blood. The desert dawn came with no mercy. Blinding, gold, and cruel. The first light crawled across the valley like a living thing, spilling over the red cliffs and burning through the last shreds of shadow. Every rock and thorn bush seemed to shimmer under its touch. It was the kind of morning that turned sweat to dust and silence to a heavy weight upon the heart. Jesse McGraw was already awake. He had not slept. Through the long hours of night, he had sat by the ashes of the dying fire, watching the stars fade one by one. The Apache woman slept lightly beside her daughter, their faces half hidden beneath a blanket of coarse wool. Each time the child stirred, Jesse's hand went to his gun, not out of fear of them, but fear of what might come from the dark. By the time the sun broke the horizon, He knew the men would be on their trail again. He could feel it. The wind carried the scent of horses, of men who'd ridden hard through the night. The hunters were close. He rose quietly and stamped out the last ember of the fire. The land was vast, but the tracks of 3 horses and a wagon saddle would stand out against the open sand. There was only one way to lose pursuit now. Through the high ridges to the north, where the cliffs met the sky and the land broke into a maze of stone. He saddled his horse, lifted the woman onto the saddle, and helped the little girl sit behind her mother. The woman was stronger now, though still pale and hollow-eyed from her ordeal. Yet there was something different in her posture this morning, something steady and unbroken. The same strength that had kept her alive on that rock was burning again beneath her quiet surface. They rode north, the sun already stinging their backs. The trail was harsh, sharp stones and narrow ledges winding upward into the ridges. Every step echoed like a drumbeat in the still air. Behind them, the open desert stretched endless and empty, save for a faint rising dust far off on the horizon. The pursuers were coming. By midday, they reached a canyon split, a deep ravine carved by centuries of rain and wind. The place was strange and silent, filled with echoes that seemed to whisper from every wall. Jesse halted there to let the horses drink from a trickle of water that ran along the rocks. The Apache woman stood at the edge, scanning the land beyond. She lifted her hand, pointing toward a narrow passage that wound between 2 high cliffs. It was the direction of the mountains. Perhaps her people's territory. Jesse nodded. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew that the open plains behind were death. The climb grew steeper. They moved slowly, their shadows shrinking under the burning sun. The heat was a living thing, pressing down on them, blurring the edges of the world. Hours passed in silence until the girl's voice, soft and hoarse, broke through the wind. She had seen something. Jesse followed her gaze. Far below, where their trail wound across the lower ridge, tiny figures moved, riders glinting in the sun like insects. 6 of them, maybe more. He could see the lead horse, a dark bay with a red-maned rider. The red, bearded man. The sight chilled the air in his lungs. They had found the trail again. Somehow. Even after a night's confusion, the hunters had picked up their scent. Jesse spurred his horse forward. The woman held tight as they wound higher through the rocks, their path twisting like a snake through the cliffs. The sound of distant shouts drifted upward, a hollow echo, growing louder. Then came the sharp crack of a rifle. A bullet sparked off the stone near Jesse's stirrup, shattering into fragments that stung his leg. The chase was on. He drove the horse harder, weaving through the narrow passes. Dust and gravel sprayed from the hooves as they climbed. Behind them, the hunters spread out, their shots ringing through the canyon. One horse stumbled, sliding on the loose shale. The woman clung to her child, her dark hair whipping in the wind. Ahead, the trail split again, one path curling upward toward the higher ridge, the other plunging down toward a dry river bed that ran into the foothills. Jesse chose the riverbed. They thundered downward, the sound of hooves echoing between the cliffs. The air filled with dust and grit. When they reached the flat bottom, Jesse pulled the horse sharply to the side and leapt down. He led them beneath a fallen boulder, a space half hidden by brush and shadow. The woman slid down beside him, holding her daughter close as Jesse covered their tracks with handfuls of sand and loose stone. The echoes of pursuit grew nearer, then fainter. The hunters passed overhead, their voices bouncing off the canyon walls, fading into the distance. For a long time, none of them moved. Only the drip of water from the rocks broke the silence. When the echoes were gone and the stillness returned, Jesse finally let out a slow breath. He was alive. They all were. He climbed back up the slope to scan the horizon. From this height, he could see the whole valley below, an ocean of red and gold, dotted with sage and the skeletons of dead trees. The riders were gone, riding westward, fooled by his diversion. But he knew they'd circle back, They were professionals, men paid to finish what they started. The woman watched him quietly as he returned. Her gaze was deep, unreadable, but something in it had changed. It wasn't fear anymore, it was trust. The faintest nod passed between them, silent but understood. She knew he had risked his life for her and the child, though he owed them nothing. As the sun began to sink, they found a small cave tucked into the base of the cliffs. There they made camp again. Jesse gathered wood and struck a small flame, careful to shield the light from view. The woman helped tend the fire, her movements still slow but steady. The girl sat close, eating from a piece of dried bread Jesse handed her. Night crept in heavy and full of stars. Coyotes cried from the far ridges, their voices long and mournful. The woman looked out at the dark horizon, and Jesse knew she was thinking of home, wherever that was, perhaps deep in the Apache lands far beyond the mountains. He wondered what story lay behind her ordeal. Why had they tied her to that rock? What crime could have earned such cruelty? Yet he didn't ask. The desert didn't need words to tell its stories, it carved them into the faces of those who survived it. The fire burned low. Jesse leaned against the cave wall, the weight of exhaustion pressing on his shoulders. Still, he didn't sleep. His thoughts kept circling the same truth. There was no turning back now. The men would come again, and when they did, they wouldn't just want the woman. They'd want him too, for getting in their way. Out there, beyond the dark horizon, destiny was gathering, like a storm crawling slow across the plains. The woman lay beside her child, eyes closed, the flicker of the fire dancing over her face. Jesse watched them for a moment longer, then looked out into the desert one last time. Somewhere beyond those hills, vengeance was riding hard, and when the next dawn broke, blood would fall on the sand again. The dawn that followed was heavy and gray, a strange morning in the desert, where light usually came sharp and merciless. A faint mist hung low in the ravines, softening the outlines of the cliffs and turning the land into a dream of ash and silver. The air carried the scent of stone and damp earth, the first promise of rain in months. Jesse McGraw stood at the mouth of the cave, watching the sky shift from silver to gold. His hat was low against the wind, his face carved with sleeplessness. Behind him, the Apache woman and her daughter were stirring. The child's soft movements broke the stillness, but even her innocence couldn't chase away the unease that clung to the air. Somewhere out there, beyond the ridges, death was still riding toward them. The red, bearded bounty hunter had not been fooled for long. Jesse knew it. A man like that didn't give up. Not after what he had done, not after the money he was promised. And if the tracks they left yesterday didn't betray them, the smoke of a single fire could. Jesse stamped out the ashes, burying every trace beneath a layer of sand. The Apache woman gathered what little they had left: his blanket, a water flask, a few scraps of dried food. Her strength was returning quickly now. There was fire behind her eyes again, the kind that belongs to someone who has seen death and refused to yield to it. The little girl clung to her side, quiet but brave, her small hand gripping the edge of her mother's torn shawl. They moved on before the sun climbed high, following a faint trail that wound through the cliffs like a scar. The canyon stretched for miles ahead, narrow, twisting, filled with strange echoes that made every step sound like a whisper from another time. It was a place the settlers called the Canyon of Ghosts, and they spoke of it with fear. Long ago, they said, an Apache village had been slaughtered there. Men, women, and children, and the spirits of the dead still wandered in the stone. Jesse didn't believe in ghosts, but the silence of the place made even his seasoned heart uneasy. No bird sang. No wind moved the branches of the few dead trees. Every sound they made, the creak of leather, the hoofstep of the horse, the soft cry of the child, seemed to echo too long, as if the canyon itself were listening. By midday, the heat returned, pressing down in waves. The canyon walls shimmered like molten metal. Jesse dismounted to lead the horse through a narrow passage, where the stone rose high on either side like the walls of a cathedral. In the shadows, petroglyphs covered the rock, ancient carvings of hunters, spirits, and suns. The Apache woman touched one of the symbols lightly with her fingertips. Her eyes lingered on it with recognition, a memory buried deep in her blood. For a long time, they moved in silence. Then, far behind, a faint rumble broke the stillness. It was distant at first, like thunder beyond the horizon, but growing louder with every heartbeat. Jesse turned sharply. His instincts told him before his eyes confirmed it. Riders again. The red, bearded man and his crew had found the trail. Panic flared in the child's face, but her mother steadied her with a hand. Jesse scanned the canyon ahead. There was no clear way out. Only the twisting path that vanished into shadow. He had 2 bullets left in his rifle, a revolver nearly empty, and nowhere to hide. Yet he knew this land could still favor them if he moved fast. He led them into a side passage, a narrow cut in the rock barely wide enough for the horse. The path climbed steeply upward, the ground slippery with loose stones. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew closer. The echo of hooves, the harsh shouts of men, the unmistakable ring of iron against rock. The climb was brutal. The woman stumbled once, and Jesse caught her arm before she fell. The girl's breathing came ragged and thin. The horse, foaming at the mouth, struggled for footing on the incline. Sweat poured down Jesse's back as he pulled them higher, every muscle screaming with the effort. The red cliffs above them burned like fire under the sun. Then the sound of a rifle cracked through the air. A bullet struck the wall beside them, sending shards of rock flying. Another shot followed, then another. The hunters had reached the mouth of the canyon. Jesse urged the horse forward one last time, driving it into the mouth of a hidden hollow near the ridge. The entrance was masked by brush and stone, invisible from below. They scrambled inside, hearts pounding, as the echoes of gunfire faded into the distance. Dust settled around them. Silence returned. Inside the hollow, the air was cool and still. A narrow tunnel opened deeper into the mountain, carved by time and rain. Faint light filtered through cracks above, painting the walls in ribbons of gold. The woman sank to her knees, holding her daughter close. Jesse leaned against the wall, his breath coming hard. He could hear his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Outside, the riders searched the lower canyon, their voices carried faintly through the stone. But they didn't climb. The passage was too steep, too hidden. For now, they were safe. The woman reached into the folds of her shawl and drew out something. A small pouch of animal hide, tied with a strip of sinew. She opened it carefully, revealing a pendant carved from bone and turquoise, strung on a cord of leather. She placed it in Jess's hand. The symbol etched into the pendant matched the carvings on the canyon walls. The mark of an ancient Apache clan. Jesse turned it in his fingers, the cool stone gleaming faintly in the dim light. He understood then that this woman was not just a wanderer or a victim. She was someone important among her people, someone the white men feared. Perhaps a leader's wife, or even a healer. The reason she had been tied to that rock was not mere cruelty. It was message and revenge. They waited until dusk before leaving the hollow. The air outside had cooled, the desert painted in shades of red and violet. The hunters were gone. For now. But Jesse knew they would not stop. They had seen his tracks once before, and they would again. As they moved on through the canyon's winding shadows, the woman looked back once, her eyes reflecting the dying light. Somewhere ahead lay her homeland. The sacred mesas where her people still lived, hidden from the reach of white men. If they could make it there, she might be safe. But between them and freedom lay miles of desert, and the ghosts of those who never made it across. When night fell, the stars came out in a blaze of silver. The canyon glowed under their light, its walls whispering like an ocean of stone. Jesse walked at the front, rifle in hand, scanning every ridge and shadow. Behind him, the woman and her child rode close, their silhouettes small against the vast, empty land. The desert was quiet again. But it was the kind of quiet that never lasted. Somewhere beyond the next ridge, the red, bearded man was already lighting a campfire, his eyes fixed on the tracks he had found. He had lost them once, but he would not lose them again. By morning, he would ride into the Canyon of Ghosts, bringing death with him, and the next sunrise would decide who the desert would keep, and who it would bury. The morning rose blood, red over the desert horizon, its light spilling across the Canyon of Ghosts like a wound reopening to the sun. The air was dry and heavy, the wind carrying the scent of dust and stone. Far below the cliffs, the land spread wide and endless, a sea of sand broken only by twisted mesquite and jagged rock. Somewhere out there, death was still following. Jesse McGraw saddled his horse in silence. The Apache woman stood nearby, her dark hair tangled by the wind, her face calm but unreadable. The child watched from the shadows, clutching her mother's shawl, her eyes wide with the wary understanding of someone far too young to know such fear. There was no need for words between them anymore. The road ahead would either save them, or swallow them whole. They had been riding for days, always one step ahead of the men who hunted them. The red, bearded leader and his gang had not stopped. Each night, their campfires glowed faintly on the horizon, drawing closer. Each dawn, Jesse found new tracks in the dust, fresh hoofprints, cigarette ash, the faint mark of wagon wheels. The hunters were closing in, and there would be no more running once the desert ended. Ahead lay a narrow trail that led toward the Sierra Mesas, the sacred lands of the Apache. The woman's eyes followed that horizon with quiet hope. But to reach it, they would have to cross the open flats. A stretch of scorched ground, where the sun killed as quickly as bullets. And once they stepped into that open ground, there would be no place to hide. The first hours passed in silence, the sound of hooves dull against the sand. Heat shimmered around them, bending the air like a mirage. Jesse kept his hand near his rifle, his gaze flicking between the ridges. He could feel it in his bones, the way a storm feels before it breaks. The land had gone too quiet. Even the wind had stilled. By noon, the heat was unbearable. The little girl swayed in the saddle, her skin flushed. Jesse stopped beneath a crooked outcrop of stone, offering what little water they had left. The woman took it, dividing it carefully between her daughter and the horse before drinking a single drop herself. There was strength in her restraint, the kind of quiet endurance that belonged to the desert itself. It was then that Jesse heard it. A faint, rhythmic tremor in the distance. At first it was only a whisper through the sand. Then it grew louder, until the ground itself began to hum. Horses, many of them. He turned, eyes narrowing toward the far ridge. A cloud of dust was rising, the sun catching on metal and movement. The riders had found them. The red-bearded man rode at the front, his rifle raised high. The rest followed in a ragged line, guns gleaming, faces hard with purpose. They had tracked their prey across 3 days of desert, and now they meant to finish what they started. Jesse's pulse quickened. He knew there was no escaping this time. The land was too flat, too open. The only way through was to flight. He turned his horse toward the north ridge, where a field of tall red rocks stood like tombstones against the light. The narrow passages there could be used to their advantage. He led the woman and her daughter forward, the horse's hooves pounding against the dry ground as the sound of pursuit roared behind them. The chase tore across the flats like fire. Dust exploded beneath their horses. The woman clung to her child, her shawl whipping in the wind. Jesse rode hard, the sun burning his back, the sound of gunfire echoing through the canyon. Bullets hissed through the air, striking the sand around them. The riders were close. Too close. They reached the red rocks just as the first shot struck Jesse's saddle, splintering the leather. He turned sharply, firing once over his shoulder. The shot rang true. One of the riders fell from his horse, crashing into the dust. But the rest kept coming. He drove the horse into the maze of rocks, weaving through narrow passages where the sun cut sharp lines of light. The echoes of pursuit bounced off the stone, confusing sound and distance. The woman held tight as Jesse led them into a dead-end canyon, a bowl of stone surrounded by cliffs. There was no way out but the way they came in. He knew then that the desert had made its choice. He turned his horse to face the canyon mouth, reloading his rifle with steady hands. The woman slid from the saddle, pulling her daughter close. Her eyes met his, calm and unwavering. She understood what he meant to do. The first rider appeared through the haze, rifle raised. Jesse fired once, the sound cracking like thunder. The man dropped. Another came, then two more. The air filled with dust and gunfire, echoing between the cliffs. Jesse fought like a man who had nothing left to lose. The woman shielded her child, crouched behind a boulder, as the noise of battle shook the canyon. When his rifle clicked empty, Jesse drew his revolver. He fired again and again until the hammer fell on silence. The smell of gunpowder burned in the air. Smoke and dust hung thick as fog. Then, through the haze, came the red, bearded man. He rode slowly into the canyon, his face streaked with dust, his eyes cold. He dismounted, stepping over the bodies of his men. A cruel grin tugged at his lips as he raised his rifle. Jesse reached for his empty gun. There was no time, no bullets left. The red-bearded man aimed. But before he could fire, the ground seemed to split with a sound like thunder. From the cliffs above came a shout. A sound that rolled through the canyon, like the voice of the earth itself. Then a dozen shadows appeared on the ridge, silhouettes against the sun. Apache riders. Silent, fierce, painted in the colors of war. Arrows rained down from the cliffs. The red, bearded man turned, cursing, as one arrow struck his shoulder, another his chest. He fell to the dust without a sound. The rest of his men broke and ran, their shouts fading into the desert wind. The battle was over as quickly as it had begun. The Apache riders descended from the cliffs, their leader, a tall, stern-faced man, dismounting beside the woman. There was recognition between them, a bond deeper than words. He took her hands in his, then lifted the child into his arms. Jesse stood apart, breathing hard, his clothes torn and blackened by smoke. The Apache man looked at him once, measured silent, then gave a slow nod. Respect, not thanks. Among warriors, that was enough. The woman turned to Jesse. The firelight of sunset caught her eyes, and for a moment, all the pain of the past days seemed to fade. She placed her hand over her heart, then touched her daughter's head. A gesture that said everything words could not. Then she turned and mounted one of the Apache horses, the child before her, and together they rode into the crimson light of the setting sun, vanishing into the mesas beyond. Jesse watched them go, the desert wind tugging at his coat. The silence returned, vast and endless. The bodies of the fallen hunters lay scattered in the dust. Above, the sky burned with the colors of fire and blood. The land was quiet again, but it was not peace. It was the silence of endings. The cowboy turned his horse toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond the mesas, another road waited, another story beginning. And as the last light died over the canyon, the wind carried a single echo. A child's voice, distant and soft, carried through the desert air. It was the sound of freedom. The sun dipped low across the western sky, spilling long shadows over the red mesas. The desert was quiet now, save for the low whistle of wind winding through the canyons. The battle was over. The hunters were gone. But peace in the Wild West never lasted long. It only paused, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Jesse McGraw rode slowly, his horse wary and dust-covered. Every muscle in his body ached from the fight. His shirt was torn, the brim of his hat singed from gunfire, and yet his eyes stayed sharp, scanning the horizon. Behind him, the trail was empty, marked only by the faint prints of hooves leading away from the canyon of death. Ahead, the endless wild stretched out in all directions. Untamed, ancient, and unforgiving. He had done what he set out to do. The woman and her child were safe, taken by their people back into the mesas where no white man dared follow. The memory of the girl's voice, soft, pleading, desperate, still echoed in his mind. Please, help her. He had, and it had nearly cost him everything. But there was something unfinished still. The West didn't let go easily. He camped that night beneath a cluster of boulders, the fire crackling weakly in the cold wind. Above him, stars scattered across the black like shards of broken glass. The desert, in its silence, always demanded reflection. Jesse sat there, staring into the flames, the memories flickering with the firelight, the woman tied under the burning sun, the ropes cutting into her wrists, the small child crying out for help. He had come upon them by accident, yet it felt like fate had led him there. Something deeper than chance had bound their paths together. As the fire burned low, he thought of his own mother, buried long ago on a lonely hill in Kansas, the grave marked only by a wooden cross. He remembered her voice, soft and kind, and the way she used to tell him that kindness was the only thing that made a man truly strong. It had been years since he'd listened to that voice. The West had hardened him, taken his innocence, left only the grit of survival. Yet, saving that Apache woman and her child had reminded him that he was still human. There was still a heartbeat beneath the dust. By dawn, the fire had died, and the air was sharp with cold. He saddled his horse and turned east, toward the rising sun. He had no home to return to, no one waiting. But he knew he couldn't stay in the Apache lands. These mesas held stories that were not his to tell. As he rode, the land began to change. The red rocks gave way to dry plains. The skeletons of dead trees dotted the horizon. Far in the distance, he saw smoke, a faint, twisting column rising against the pale sky. Instinct told him to turn away, but something stronger, curiosity, perhaps duty, drew him toward it. When he reached the source, he found the remains of a burned wagon. Scattered supplies, broken wheels, and the smell of charred wood filled the air. The sand was littered with footprints, many of them small. It looked like settlers had been ambushed, perhaps by raiders or outlaws. But something was strange. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle beyond the fire. Just emptiness. He dismounted and crouched beside the ashes, brushing away soot until he found a small object half buried in the sand. It was a child's necklace, woven leather with a tiny turquoise bead. His heart clenched. He had seen one just like it before, around the neck of the little Apache girl. It couldn't be. He rose, scanning the horizon. The trail led north, faint but clear. Hoofprints, many of them, heading toward the cliffs. He followed, his pulse quickening with every mile. The land grew harsher, the wind sharper. The air carried a distant echo, coyote calls maybe, or something else. By midday, he found them. The Apache camp lay hidden in a hollow between two cliffs, smoke curling from small fires. Children played near the rocks, and women moved quietly among the tents. At first, everything seemed peaceful. But as Jesse approached, he saw the tension. Men gathered near the edge of camp, weapons drawn, faces grim. And in the center stood the woman he had saved, her wrists bound once more, ropes cutting into her skin. For a long moment, Jesse didn't move. He thought perhaps it was a dream, some cruel mirage painted by the desert heat. But no, the truth was written in the hard faces around her. The Apache believed she had betrayed them by leading a white man into their sacred land. Jesse could feel the weight of it all. The irony, the injustice, the tragedy that seemed to haunt every corner of the frontier. He had risked everything to save her, and now her people saw that salvation as a curse. From the cliffs above, an elder stepped forward, tall and silent, his expression carved from stone. His eyes locked on Jesse, then shifted to the woman. No words were spoken, yet the message was clear. This was the price of crossing the boundary between two worlds. Jesse dismounted slowly, hands raised to show he carried no weapon. The camp fell into stillness. He stepped closer until he stood beside the woman. She looked up at him, no fear in her eyes now, only calm acceptance. The child stood nearby, clutching her mother's shawl, tears streaking her cheeks. In that moment, Jesse understood what had to be done. He untied his own bandana and placed it on the ground before the elder, a gesture of respect, of surrender, and of truth. Then, without a word, he took out his knife and cut the woman's ropes. The camp erupted in shouts, but the elder lifted a hand, silencing them. His eyes remained fixed on Jesse. It was as if the old man saw something deeper than skin or blood, something of spirit. Perhaps he recognized that the cowboy had not come to harm, only to heal a wound the land itself had made. The woman stepped back, free once again. The child rushed into her arms, sobbing softly. Jesse turned to leave, knowing his presence could only bring more danger. But as he mounted his horse, the elder raised his staff and spoke a single phrase in the Apache tongue. Words Jesse couldn't understand, yet somehow knew the meaning of. Go in peace. He rode away, the sound of hooves fading into the vast silence. Behind him, the camp stood still under the blazing sun. The woman watched him go, her daughter beside her, the wind lifting their hair. She knew they would never see him again. But she also knew that their lives had been forever changed by that chance encounter in the desert. Days later, as Jesse crossed the state line, and the mesas disappeared behind him, he looked back one last time. The horizon shimmered with heat, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw a figure standing among the rocks. A woman, tall and proud, with a child at her side. Then the mirage faded, leaving only the endless desert. The west swallowed its secrets once more. The land was silent, eternal, and unyielding. And somewhere beneath that silence, the story of a cowboy and an Apache woman would live on. Not in words or legends, but in the whispers of the wind that swept across the canyon, carrying the memory of mercy, sacrifice, and redemption. It was the end of their story, but the West never truly forgets.